Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. So hello once again, engagers. Now we have another special guest today, and it's Paul. But before we get started, Paul, are you prepared to engage?
I am. Let's do it.
Let's go, because Paul Smith is one of the world's leading experts in business storytelling. You'll see why we have him in a few seconds as well. And he's one of Inc. magazine's top 100 leadership speakers of 2018. He's a storytelling coach, a best-selling author of the books The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, Sell with a Story, Lead with a Story, and Parenting with a Story. He holds also an MBA from Wharton School. He's a former consultant of Accenture and a former executive and a 20-year veteran of the Procter & Gamble company. So, Paul, is there anything we're missing that you would like to, kick in before we get started?
Oh, that sounds like plenty.
So, Paul, we have you today, as we were talking in the pre-interview chat, and engagers, if you're wondering, as you probably have realized, storytelling, narrative, and all these things are fundamental to creating games, gamification, and all things related. So we wanted to bring in somebody who dedicates himself specifically to storytelling. And that's why Paul Smith is with us today, because we've seen fantastic work coming from him. So, Paul, can you tell us, what does, a regular day or a regular week, if such a thing exists with you, if being Paul in a day like today, what does it look like? What does it feel like?
Yeah, well, there is no typical day for sure. There are two types of typical days, though. There's days where I'm at home wearing blue jeans and a t-shirt writing a book, and days where I'm on an airplane headed somewhere, or to be on stage in front of 500 people, or sometimes it's 35 people in a room for a full day of training. And there's really nothing in between those two. I'm either on stage or I'm at home writing, or on the phone right now with somebody interviewing me, talking about one of my books. So it's kind of a dichotomy. Those are the two types of days, and obviously today is one of the blue jean days, talking to somebody about one of my books.
Fantastic to have you here, and to have some of that time that you're investing in these kinds of situations. So, Paul, we always like to come in and start strong with these questions, and we like to take a lot of lessons learned from the stories from our guests. And we would like to know if you have some sort of story where you can tell us, of course, being an expert storyteller, one of those times where you set out to do something, to achieve something using storytelling, and whether it was the final or initial failure, but to talk to us about a time where things didn't go as expected. There was an initial fail or first attempt at learning, and what did you learn from that? How did you spin it around? Or we want to be there with you, and we want to learn those lessons.
Yeah, definitely. I have several. I'll tell you one. When I was working on my first book, of course, the part of the process to get a book published, you have to find a publisher. But oftentimes before that, you have to get a literary agent to represent you if you want the best odds of getting your book published. So your first sales pitch for your new book or your new book idea is to a literary agent. But agents, it's not like you can just hire an agent like you can hire a lawyer or a doctor. You can't just go in with money and say, hey, I want to hire you to represent me. You have to convince them that your book is worthy of getting published, because they only get paid if your book gets published. Otherwise, all the work they do for you, they get nothing for it. You don't pay them a dime. So they're highly motivated to only accept clients whose book ideas they think are worthy of getting published. So they say no a lot. In fact, they say no 90% of the time. 90% of the people, aspiring authors who approach a literary agent, get told no. So the first agent I sent a proposal to for my first book idea told me no. And the second one I sent it to told me no, as did the third one, and the fourth one, and the fifth one, and the sixth one, and the seventh one. But the seventh one, instead of just saying no, what they said was, no, but maybe. And maybe means if we need to change a lot of things about your proposal to make it acceptable to publishers. So I literally worked with him for 3 months off and on, making changes to the proposal, doing more research, going back and rewriting it. At the end of the 3 months, the more junior person that the boss had assigned me to work on my proposal, we sent it back to the boss. Said, okay, we've worked on it for 3 months. This is as good as it's going to be. Will you represent this guy? And he looked at it and he said, that is a lot better. But the answer is still no. So I took that proposal that I'd spent 3 months working with agent number 7, and I didn't pay them a dime, right? I paid them nothing for all of that coaching and advice and consultation. I sent that proposal to an 8th agent who said yes immediately. She then took that proposal, made a list of publishers she thought would be most likely to be interested in the book, sent that proposal to the first one on her list. She was going to approach them one at a time. And the first one wrote me a contract, a publishing contract. And that's how my first book got published. So I failed 7 times in a row. The 8th time I didn't fail. So, I mean, part of the lesson for me is one is just persistence. Like if I'd given up after 1 or 2 no's or 3 or 5 or 6 or 7, right, I would still be working at Procter & Gamble in my 9-to-5 job instead of living the life that I'd imagined as an author. And
the odds ended up in your favor because if they reject 9 out of 10, you got to 8, not 9.
Yeah. And so I'd heard that statistic before. So I was kind of prepared for, 1 yes out of 10, but you kind of hope it's the first or second in the 10 and not the 10th, right? I got to number 7 or 8. I got to 8. Yeah. So, but the other lesson there was get help from people along the way. So whoever it is that's telling you no in whatever it is that you're selling or pushing or trying to get people to agree with, if they say no, ask why. Why not? What would have to be true for you to say yes? And whatever you learn from them will make that change. And then the next time you're more likely to get a yes.
That makes a lot of sense, and in many other contexts as well. And that's why we like to have guests with a different perspective, not only our typical experts in gamification, who are great, but also coming from different industries and approaches. Because here, I would definitely say that is a very strong lesson for many of us, because it's not just about the lonely journey of, the hero who's there and who achieves everything on his or her own. The thing is, you will very certainly need a lot of help along the way, as well. When you play most games, it's not just about the lonely hero. You usually have some help. You encounter other people who give you gifts, items, and whatnot. And that's the way you get to learn many things, and you get to be a lot better. So I would definitely encourage you, whatever it is that you're pursuing right now, a career in gamification as a consultant, or you want to just create a project, whatever it is, definitely seek out for help. And people who say your work is not very good, or maybe less kind words than those, that why is definitely a massive, massive learning that you can get from that. So thanks for that story, Paul.
Sure.
And shifting that, 180 degrees, instead of going for, one of the hardships, one of the difficult times, how about we go this time for something you actually achieved when using, your storytelling, using your abilities by telling stories. And of course, it became a success, something you're proud to tell us a story about that. And of course, drive us through that story. Let us know what you learned. And we want to learn from that as well.
Well, if I could follow the same theme of getting books published, so my 5th book just came out last week, actually, and I've been working on it for over 6 years, so almost as long as I've been writing books, and I've literally published 4 books since I started working on this book 6 years ago. This one took a long time, obviously longer than all of the others, almost combined. And part of the reason was because it was a very different book than all of my other books. So all my other books are basically business books. So Lead with a Story is the first one. Sell with a Story is the third one. The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell is the one that came out just this summer. So they're business books for leaders who want to be better at storytelling. This book that just came out last week is called 4 Days with Kenny Tedford. And it's a biography about a man who's deaf in both ears and legally blind in one eye and couldn't speak till he was 10 years of age. And so he's basically, Andy has a learning disability. So he's basically like a combination of Helen Keller and Forrest Gump, even though Forrest Gump's fictional. But he's got both of these sets of life challenges. And he just led this fascinating life that I just was convinced after I met him that the world has to hear this man's story, because it's amazing, it's tragic, it's heroic, it's sad, it's happy, it's everything that you would imagine in the life of a man who's like a child walking around in a grown man's body that's disabled, But anyway, so I had a hard time getting it written, a hard time getting it published, a hard time finding a publisher. And I think what made the difference was that in the proposal, I ended up instead of whatever I did have there, I just put the story of how we met. And I can tell you the short version of it is we were both at a conference, a 3-day storytelling festival of all things. And I was speaking in one room and he was speaking in another room. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. And then we ended up meeting in a third room where we were both sitting on the front row watching somebody else perform. And I'm one of those front row people. I want to be up there and involved and see it up close. And usually I'm the only person up there, right? You know, you go to these conferences and like everybody tries to sit in the back so they can goof off and look at their phone and or get to the bathroom quickly or whatever it is. Be closer to the coffee. Like nobody wants to sit in the front row at these conferences. Well, I did. So I was up there basically all by myself on the front row. And this guy comes in and sits right next to me. There are plenty of other seats, but he sat right next to me. He's an older guy, overweight, kind of walked funny, had a funny limp, and he sits down. And then this guy was in his 60s. This young 20-something kid comes following right behind him, grabs a chair. These were like all folding chairs. Grabs a chair, turns it around backwards, puts it right in front of this old guy, and sits down in it facing this guy with his back to the stage. Right, and it's like 3 minutes until this thing's going to start. And I'm like, well, that's weird, right? Everything about this is weird, right? And so as soon as the person on stage started talking, this young kid, 20-something guy, he lifted his hands up in front of his chest and immediately started doing what I recognized as sign language. And I was like, oh, this guy sitting next to me is deaf. And he's at a 3-day storytelling festival. And I just thought that was really bold, right? So I was like, I've got to meet this guy. So anyway, I ended up meeting him during a break and we, hit it off, and he ended up telling me over lunch just some fascinating stories, and ended up just convinced that somebody's got to write this man's story. But anyway, I ended up putting with some more detail behind that first moment that I met him and how my fascination with him started and grew. And I'm convinced that made the rest of the proposal more interesting because they got to learn, as I did, about his many disabilities. Instead of me saying, okay, this is a book proposal about a deaf guy that couldn't speak and is kind of blind in one eye. Like I didn't do that. I started it off. Imagine me sitting there on the front row of this 3-day storytelling festival. And this guy comes up and sits right next to me, and I just tell him the story. So they get to figure out what was weird about the situation as I was figuring it out in the story instead of being told in advance. And I just think that's a much better way to capture an audience's attention and get them to listen to you.
Super, super, super powerful. I guess that there's so many things we could take from that. One you already just mentioned, and it's about turning it into a story rather than just a collection of facts, which is, I think that we can't hear this enough, the importance of these things when trying to deliver a message. And we're always trying to deliver a message, some sort of message. So storytelling is a central key point, and I love the way that you put it there. It's not just about dumping whatever information is there. You were putting the reader at the center of the story to be part of that sort of hero's or collective journey, and
right.
and make them gather those insights with you. So it was almost as if they were active in the story, which is something I love about that.
Right. In fact, that's worth going a little bit deeper into, because there are 3 positions in storytelling or movie writing or book writing that you can put your audience in relative to the characters in the book. They can either be in superior, inferior, or equal position. So if you write it or create the story such that your audience is in superior position to the characters, that means the audience knows more about what's going on in the story than the characters. So that's like a horror movie where you're sitting in the movie theater watching and you see the guy behind the curtains with the knife in the kitchen, and then you see the person walking through the kitchen and she has no idea she's about to get stabbed, but you, the audience member, you know it because you can see the guy behind the curtain. You're in superior position, and that creates angst and stress, and it creates a certain set of emotions. But if the author of the story puts the audience in inferior position, that means you know less about what's going on than the characters in the story. So that's like a Sherlock Holmes novel where, Sherlock's got it all figured out, right? But you don't know who done it yet. You don't know who the murderer is, but Sherlock Holmes has got it all figured out. And you spend the rest of the story, Sherlock explaining to you what happened. And that creates curiosity, and a different set of emotions. But what I did in that story was put the audience in equal position, the third position, which is where they don't find out anything before the story or after. They find it out only at the exact moment that me, the character in the story, found it out. And to me, that's the most powerful position to put your audience in, because that way they go through the same emotions that the characters are going through, the surprise and the joy and the sorrow and everything like that. So you've got to be choiceful at what position you put your audience in when you're telling a story.
Yes, definitely. And I'd never heard of that. It makes all the sense in the world, of course, but I had never heard it split that way. So that's a fantastic strategy as well to think about because again, creating games, creating stories, it's all about how do you want to make your players or your audience feel. So that perspective makes all the difference in that sense.
Yeah. So if in game writing, if you wanted to create a sensation of that angst and fear, and then you want to put the audience in superior position, you want them to see the danger before the character sees the danger, so that they're on the edge of their seat, go, oh my gosh, don't step there, you're going to blow up, or don't, do this, you're going to get shot, or, that creates that kind of a stressful moment, and again, you choose which of those positions you want to put them in based on what kind of experience you want them to have.
Absolutely. And we've heard about these two moments you've had, and it's always easy to wonder, how do you get to this level of storytelling? And if you have some sort of, I don't know, if it's a process, if it's a thought strategy, like how do you create a storytelling? I mean, whether it's, a book or whether it's a talk you want to give, is there any, like, I don't know, duplicable kind of steps or process that you follow? How does it work for you?
Yeah. Well, so that's, of course, the topic of the books I write and the training courses I teach. I teach people how to be better storytellers. Usually, in my case, it's not necessarily for game developers, obviously, but for just people in business in general, leaders and marketers, salespeople, whatever your job function is. And I think that would very much apply to game developers as well. And so, yes, that's what the topic of my books is it takes you through the process of crafting a story, starting from, what is it that what is your objective in telling this story? That's the first question you have to ask as somebody who's about to tell a story. What is your goal? Your leadership or your communication, or in your case, the experience that you want the audience to have. What's your goal in telling the story? And then you can pick a story to tell, or more likely, pick a moment in time to craft a story around. Because a story is really a narrative about something that happened to someone, right? It's not just a list of things to go do, or reasons to buy what I'm selling, or reasons to go do what. Yeah, it's not. So first, what's my goal? Secondly, what is a moment in time where something happened to someone, or in the case of gaming, if you're inventing it, it's a fictional thing, what would be something that could happen that would accomplish that game objective for somebody, that experience objective? And then you craft a story around that moment in time. So stories are always about something that happened at one particular moment, not like, well, over the course of 30 years, here's kind of what happened. Well, that's a saga. Most stories are bite-sized 3 to 4 minute type things that are about a single moment in time. So you pick that moment, and then you do follow a process, right? So I lay this out in the books, and I'll share it with you here. The structure of the story that I find most effective. You talked about the hero's journey story earlier, and I think that's great for really long form stories, and maybe for the overarching storyline in a Skyrim or something, where there's this long multiple day adventure that you might have, that can make some sense. When you're trying to craft shorter stories, there really, I just think, 8 questions that your story needs to answer. And that hero's journey storytelling structure, there's 17 steps just to the plot, and that's only the plot, right? There's more that goes on. But for shorter stories, I think here are the questions I think you need to answer. First of all, why should I bother listening to the story? So you need to give your audience a reason to listen to the story. But once you've done that, then the next 5 questions come pretty fast. Where and when did it take place? Who's the main character and what did they want? What was the problem or opportunity that they ran into? What did they do about it? and how did it turn out in the end? Right? That ought to sound like the natural flow of a story, and it is. But if you're keeping track, there's 2 questions left, 7 and 8. And so the last 2 questions are, what did you learn from it? And what should I go do now? Like, this is that's your opportunity to make a recommendation on what they should do now that they've learned the lesson from the story that they just heard or witnessed or participated in. Now, those are the 8 questions I craft for my business leaders and business audiences that are trying to get their job done at work. If you're crafting a game and you're trying to craft a story within a game, maybe you don't need that last number 8 or maybe even number 7. I don't know. But you've definitely got to have 2 through 5 because that's the basics of or 2 through 6. That's the basics of a story. And you might also want number 1 because you might want to give the audience a reason to click here, do this, or engage yourself in this little storyline that's about to go down this interesting rabbit hole. You've got to entice them to want to go do that. Let them know that they're going to enjoy that experience.
Absolutely. Those steps make, huge amount of sense. And especially step 1, what do you want to do with this is something that we've seen as well, replicated in most games, in gamified strategies, serious gaming, educational games. Because if you don't know what you want to achieve, as in anything in business and life, probably, you're going to have a hard time achieving it or knowing if you achieved it or not.
Right.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification.
So, Paul, is there something that you would like to call, I don't like silver bullets or that kind of thing, but is there something that you would call maybe a best practice or something that if you attempt to use this, it probably is going to help improve your storytelling or your story, the story that you're going to use? Is there such an element or, again, best practice?
Yeah, there are several, but probably the one that would be worthy of sharing right now is that having a surprise somewhere in your story is really effective technique to make the story more memorable, more enjoyable, and more effective for whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. If you want people to act on something, or even, like I said, even if it's just a story inside of a game, they'll remember it more and enjoy it more. And there's a lot of physiological reasons why that's true. So like literally a surprise releases some adrenaline in your system. And that adrenaline affects the memory consolidation process, which is the process by which something gets into short-term memory. So a surprise literally physiologically makes the experience more memorable. It also makes it more fun. So it's important to have a surprise in a story. And there's and it's especially important at the end of the story, I think. And there's a simple technique to create a surprise in just about any story. And I'll just demonstrate it for you right here. So imagine a young boy named James, right? So 9-year-old kid. He's in the kitchen. He's in the kitchen with his mom and his mom's sister. So while mom and auntie are sitting at the kitchen table having a cup of tea, James is standing at the stove watching the tea kettle boil. And he's just fascinated with it, right? He's watching the steam come out the top of the kettle, and he's got a spoon, and he holds it up there into the jet of steam and watches the steam condenses into little drops of water and kind of trickle down the spoon and drip into a cup that he's got sitting there for that purpose. And he's just watching this cycle go over and over and over again, just fascinated with it. Well, eventually his mother just yells at him. She's like, James, go read a book, go ride your bike, go do your homework, do something. Aren't you ashamed of yourself just wasting your time staring at the tea kettle boiling? Well, fortunately, young James was undaunted, I guess, by his mother's admonition, because 20 years later, at the age of 29, of course, and in the year 1765, James Watt reinvented the steam engine, ushering in the Industrial Revolution that we, of course, all benefit from today, and all based on a fascination with steam that he developed at the age of 9 in his mother's kitchen. All right? So, true story. So, now the first time I read that story was in a book titled James Watt. All right? It was a biography of the inventor of the steam engine written in 1905 by Andrew Carnegie. So, of course, it was no surprise to me at all that the story in chapter 1 about young James in the kitchen was a story about James Watt, the guy who would later go on to invent the steam engine. Because the whole book was about him, right? But to you and anyone listening, unless they're a really good history buff, you were probably surprised at the end of that story to find out, oh, that 9-year-old James, that was James Watt, inventor of the steam engine, right? And why were you surprised by that? And the answer is simple, because I didn't tell you his last name, right? And so the technique is I took one vital piece of information, maybe 2 in this case, his name and the year, Those two things are supposed to be delivered to the audience at the beginning of the story. It's question number 2, where and when did the story take place? And question number 3, who's the main character? All right. So these are normally supposed to be delivered at the beginning. That's where a human being is expecting that type of information to be in a story. Now, if you take a bunch of pieces of information and put them in the wrong place, you're just going to have a really janked up story, right? But if you can smartly take one or two small things from the beginning of the story that your audience is expecting and don't give it to them until the end of the story, presto, you've just created a surprise ending. It doesn't have to be their last name. It could be just about anything, but that's an example of it. So that's how to create a surprise at the end of your story.
Wow, there you go. That was exciting, definitely, and very instructive as well, as a way to, not cover information because you're not covering it, but just not revealing it until it is the right time. And I love that technique as well.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. You're revealing it at the right time to create the storytelling experience that you want your audience to have.
Absolutely. And Paul, after listening to these questions and seeing what the whole podcast kind of is about, is there anybody that comes to your mind that you would like to listen to in an interview like this one in Professor Game?
Somebody I suggest that you would have on your podcast?
That you would be interested in listening to as well.
Yeah, I personally, so I'm not a big gamer myself, but I would, but my kids are, so I get to experience games secondhand. And the two favorite, my youngest son's favorite game is Minecraft, and my older son's favorite game is Skyrim, that I think I mentioned earlier. Yeah, I'd love to hear from the people who develop those, what their thinking is behind them and how they develop them the way they do. And like in Skyrim, it's obviously the whole thing I think is story based, and so I'd kind of like to get into their head. But I love Minecraft, that my kid plays Minecraft, or did for many years, because I think it's just such a creative game. And I think that's something that's missing in a lot of games, is the ability for the audience to the player to create something, as opposed to just watch a movie and direct the players in a limited number of alternatives. Whereas Minecraft is almost unlimited what you can do in there. So
yeah, it's what they call a sandbox. So you can almost create anything there. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Now I've got a name for it now. Thank you.
There you go. And is there, of course, in your terrain, aside from your excellent books, is there a book you would like to see accompanying your books right next to our bookcase that you would recommend to an audience like this one who is interested in storytelling, maybe how to apply it to games, but it could just be plain storytelling or anything related that you think would be interesting?
Yeah, I'm probably not familiar enough with your industry to make a good recommendation there, but I can tell you that out of all of my 5 books, if there's one that would help a game developer the most, I would say it's probably Sell with a Story, which is my 3rd book. And the reason for that is because the 2/3 of that book is not about sales stories. It's about how do you craft a story, period. So I go into the most detail in that book on how do you craft a story so those 8 questions I mentioned earlier, they're in the book. The technique I mentioned about how to create a surprise ending, that's in that book, along with dozens of other techniques for creating good stories. That's the book that they're in. So I think that'd be the most useful for your audience.
That makes a lot of sense, Paul. And of course, I know you're not a gamer. I know you're not deeply into games as many of the guests that we have, but we would like to know, what is your favorite game?
Dude, the last video game I played was probably Space Invaders. So yeah,
that's a good one.
Which dates me quite a bit. So I don't play any now. I enjoy watching my kids play them though, but I decline every time they ask me to join them just because I don't know what I'm doing. But those are their favorites, so they are kind of my favorite by proxy, that I enjoy watching them play those games, as opposed to a lot of the other games that I think are, the more violent first-person action type games are probably low on my list of favorites for my kids to play. But I think those 2 I mentioned are pretty healthy alternatives.
Fantastic. And what would you say is your sort of your superpower, your sweet spot when telling stories? What's that thing that makes you stand out from the rest of storytellers?
Well, since the type of storytelling I typically traffic in are business stories, The difference between me and a lot of people who do what I do is that I've actually spent most of my career as a business executive, not as a storytelling coach or trainer. I think, and not to knock those folks, I'm sure they're very good at what they do, but if what your expertise is how to write a 19th century romance novel, it's going to be hard for you to coach a business executive on how to craft a leadership story, or a salesperson to craft a sales story, or a marketing person to craft a marketing story. But somebody like me who's spent 20 plus years of my career in jobs like that, I know the kind of stories they need, and now I've got some expertise for how to craft them better. And I think there's not a lot of people in my space that have that combination of experiences.
So that is definitely your superpower, Paul. And of course, we are running out of time. But before we leave, of course, I want to know, where can we connect with you, where we can find you in the internet, in a webpage, and social media? Where do you want the audience to go out and reach out to you if they have, I don't know, questions, just to want to follow your work?
Yeah, the simplest way is my website, which has links to all those things that you just mentioned, and it's leadwithastory.com. So it's just the name of my first book. I guess I was never more creative with website naming after that, but yeah, leadwithastory.com.
Fantastic. We will have that in the show notes as well. And first of all, thank you very much, Paul, for spending, or investing actually, all this time with us here in Professor Game Podcast with the Engagers today. However, for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast, and I really hope you enjoyed this interview with our star storyteller, Paul. And do you have any questions that you would like to ask other guests? All you have to do is go to professorgame.com/question and ask that question, or those questions. If it is selected, and I'm pretty sure you can get a question selected, it will come up in a future episode and you will be answered live, and even perhaps you might get some visibility, because if you want me to mention you, I certainly will. But before you go on to your next mission, would you like to know what is up on the Good Game podcast? Then subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. I will see you there.